Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Woolfolk again. Woolfolk the other way at the 30, the 40. Woolfolk to midfield. Miles Woolfolk with the pick. The Heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory. Williams is the running back next to Howe. Play action. Howe will now lob it down the near side. Newsom with a man all over him. Pins the ball against the back of the defender and brings it in. Heels can get a first down at the 3. Howe, pump fake to the right. Now he's going to run to the left. Howe at the 5. Takes the shot. Pinballing off the Canes for the touchdown. Sam Howe showing the toughness for 6. Cardinals down 4, 35-31. May has the shotgun snap. Pressure coming. Rolls to the right. Throws to the end zone. Touchdown! Touchdown, Antoine Green! 16 seconds to go. No flag. Snapping it off the 8-yard line. May pulls it, tries to roll it apart. Now he's going to throw it and score! Christian May throws it to Payson in the end zone for the touchdown. They have thrown it plenty through the left hand. Was rolling out on the run and threw it left-handed. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading in with Barshot. Theo at the 35. Theo, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Theo, he's going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, here with you guys, as always, coming at you on a Saturday afternoon, and time to talk a little more Tar Heel recruiting here. The final week of official visits here in the summer. Of course, Carolina can still have official visitors that will be able to come to campus during the season. Excuse me. And you would imagine that Carolina is going to try to take advantage of that as we go throughout the fall. They're hoping that they can put together some better results on the field and potentially be able to flip some guys along the way. But they're hoping to do some of that even before they get to the fall. There are some big names that are out there, including one that we'll decide later on today. We'll tell you about where Carolina sits for him. There's some other news, a ton of different guys in the class that have already visited Chapel Hill that have made decisions as of this week. There's one visitor that Carolina was expecting to have that is no longer going to take an official visit after he was scheduled to visit earlier in the month. And then you do have a bunch of guys that were scheduled to visit this weekend that are no longer scheduled to visit. And then, of course, we'll tell you about the guys that are on campus. There are 4 confirmed visitors on campus, 1 wild card that might be on campus, might not be. So we'll talk about him. But we got to start with Carolina losing a commitment in the 2027 class. And look, anytime you lose a commitment, there are going to be people that are going to be concerned. I saw some people when I put the article out commenting and saying that this is just another example of Bill Belichick and his staff not doing the things that they promised that they were going to be doing when they came here. This is more normal stuff for this regime. This was a decommitment that was expected for a long time, and that is 3-star wide receiver Skylar Robinson, who, of course, had been committed to Carolina since last January. So he was easily the longest standing commitment that Carolina had in this class, was the first guy that ever committed in the 2027 class. But, with him, a lot of it was based on the fact that his brother was committed here. He was probably a better prospect than his brother was. I think he's going to be a guy that might end up being a better player than his brother was. And Jason Robinson Jr., who was, of course, here last year, the transfer from Washington, who now has ended up at Portland State. There's a good chance that could be where Skylar Robinson ends up as well. This is, one of those prospects that we've seen a few guys like this. He was not really solidly committed to Carolina during this summer because he didn't visit Chapel Hill at all during the spring. And so it was kind of known that he was going to be a guy that was probably going to head elsewhere. And I think at that point, you were believing that he would be someone that would be taking official visits to other schools and at least getting a look at them, at least that he would take an official visit to Portland State. As far as we know, based off of what 24/7 Sports is reporting, On3 Sports has reported, and Rivals, there hasn't really been any sort of official visit that he's taken anywhere else. And so his recruitment is just a complete mystery at this point. Doesn't matter for Carolina because they are not going to end up landing his commitment when it's all said and done once again. But it's one that I don't think Carolina is shocked by. I think, honestly, just judging off of some of the message boards and, just the overall vibe around it, this staff is probably shocked that it took this long because I think everybody else is. And so it's, he's a talented slot receiver. He was a guy that was ranked as a 3-star prospect, but he was outside of the top 1,000. I think there were some things that you really liked about him. But there are also some areas where he was going to have to improve once he got to the college level. And so I ultimately think it's not necessarily the biggest loss for Carolina. They're recruiting 4-star wide receiver Amari Patterson, who is a guy that looks like he's going to end up playing in the slot at this level. They're also keeping an eye on some other guys. There's Malik Ratliff, who is a guy that's on campus this weekend. That could be another guy that Carolina looks to add in that slot if they don't end up necessarily landing Amari Patterson. So that I think on that front, Carolina's got it covered. They've been recruiting knowing that he probably wasn't going to be a part of that class, but that is their longest standing commitment now gone. But it's one that shouldn't really shock anybody from a Carolina perspective. All right, now let's move on to two targets that the Tar Heels are trending for. And one of them is the guy that I just mentioned, 4-star wide receiver Amari Patterson. He is trending towards Carolina heading into Saturday's decision. He is going to decide at 6 o'clock tonight. And this is going to be on the CBS Sports College Football YouTube page. So they've gone a little bit deeper with some of these commitments. It used to be that some of these guys were on CBS Sports HQ. It used to be that some of these guys were just on 24/7 Sports YouTube page. Now they've gone to CBS College Football's YouTube page. So you got to dig a little deeper on YouTube to be able to find this, but I would imagine he's going to tweet out the link. This is a weird recruitment because it feels like the other 3 finalists that he has on the list, there's reporting from all of those angles that those teams have pulled out of his recruitment. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Sometimes, it could be that he's trending in the other direction, in another direction, and the schools just say, hey, we're pulling out now because we know we're not ultimately going to end up landing him. But that's the thing that was, being reported was that Georgia, who is a finalist for him, is out. Georgia Tech, another finalist for him, is off the table. And same thing with South Carolina. So I don't know what that means. I think there probably is some concern from Tar Heel fans about what exactly that could mean for Carolina. But I do think that this is a guy that you still look at, and you look at the 4-star billing, and he certainly is someone that Carolina would be willing to take in this class. I mean, 6 foot, 187 pounds. So again, he's probably going to be a guy that's going to play in the slot. He is a former teammate of current Tar Heel wide receiver Carnell Warren because he goes to Bluffton High School. He's from Ridgeland, South Carolina, but Bluffton High School down there in Bluffton, South Carolina. So this is someone that has familiarity with a guy that's on the roster. I think when he took his visit to Chapel Hill, what was really weird was that he took his visit back on May 29th. He didn't want it to be classified at the time as an official visit. That later changed in the verbiage later on down the line. And so now it appears that was an official visit. Carolina is, in fact, the team that is trending in this recruitment. And going into today's decision, they are the favorite. So I'm not sure, if the other schools pulling out has anything to do with him possibly being ineligible. But that is certainly something that we're going to have to monitor. It doesn't seem like Don Callahan. I saw on one of the message boards when I was going through on Inside Carolina, somebody said, does that mean that he isn't necessarily, that Carolina should be worried about him not necessarily enrolling when it's all said and done? Don Callahan said he doesn't think that at this point. And so I think that probably means that Carolina fans should be pretty excited about the possibility of landing a guy that could be a dynamic wide receiver, when it's all said and done for Carolina. Then you get to 4-star linebacker Theo Wilson. He has the Tar Heels as his leader now, following his official visit to Chapel Hill last weekend. That according to Inside Carolina earlier this week. And Chad Simmons of Rivals also said the exact same thing in a piece that he had up midweek. So looks like Theo Wilson, at least going into this weekend, had Carolina as the leader. But then you have the news that he is taking his official visit to LSU. For the longest time this week, there was thought that he was not going to take his official visit there. He was going to say, look, I'm shutting down my recruitment. I'm going to end up making my decision, and it's going to be Carolina. Now he's left the door open. We know that Carolina has taken advantage of this with some other recruits so far in this class. And it makes you worry just a little bit that LSU is going to turn the heat up on him. They badly need linebacker help at LSU. That's a position that a lot of people around that program feel very concerned about when it comes to this recruiting class. And so you would imagine that they're going to be probably turning the heat up pretty high in this recruitment or in this pursuit with him on campus over the weekend. So I think for Carolina, it's just a wait and see. You did everything that you possibly could this past week. It's a good thing that you are in the driver's seat heading into the weekend. But, LSU is going to have their shot here. You imagine that Lane Kiffin is going to be willing to put a lot of money on the table for a guy at a position where they need help. And so we'll just, ultimately have to wait and see where this ends up going. But, it looks like Carolina, at least right now, trending for 2 4-star prospects in the 2027 class. That's a good sign for Carolina. They're looking for they're looking for these guys to that can be headliners in this class. Guys that are considered these blue chip prospects. You look at what Carolina has currently, and I mean, look, they've done a pretty good job here in the last handful of weeks, bringing in some highly rated commits. But when you look at the blue chip guys, the guys in our mind, we've talked about this on this podcast before. I talked about it here recently, that we say the top 500. That's typically where we're going to go with guys and label them as blue chip prospects. How they're labeled as blue chip prospects on Rivals or on 3 is if you are a 4-star prospect. In that respect, Carolina has one. That would be Braden Booth. In the way that we do it, Carolina has 2. They have Braden Booth and Caden Robinson Vickers, who we look at here at the Heel Tough blog and say are blue chip recruits. You really like guys like Zyke Scott, Aaron Williams, Chavez Dixon, but those are guys that are ranked outside of the top 500. So they need some other headliners in this class. Getting an Amari Patterson, getting a Theo Wilson, I think would go a long way towards doing that. And I mean, look, that they would be guys that could come in and contribute early on for Carolina. You don't really have many of those guys that are here right now. Now, I don't know how much they're going to need that necessarily at the wide receiver position. They are going to need that next year at the linebacker position. So bringing in a guy like Theo Wilson to compete with the guys that they brought in this last class and the other guys that will be on the roster, I think will be very welcome. All right, now let's get to some of the other notes around the 2027 targets that Carolina has in this class. There are a lot of decisions that have been made here recently from guys that were on campus here over the last handful of weeks. Most of them were the weekend of the 29th. You have Joshua Vermeil, who made his decision, who was here in Chapel Hill the middle of that next week after May 29th. He was here June 2nd through June 4th, if I remember the dates correctly. He's the biggest name that ended up announcing his commitment. He goes elsewhere to Kansas State. This one, really shouldn't shock anybody because his brother plays at Kansas State. That was the team that I always thought was the biggest threat in this recruitment to Carolina. But it is weird that, Carolina was a team that was favored to land him, and then things went south. So I don't know what kind of feel they were getting coming out of the visit and why they decided to put in predictions for him over there at Rivals. But Don Callahan revealed that according to sources, Joshua Vermeil, or I think he actually may have sat down and talked to him, that Vermeil was not happy with the fact that Bill Belichick did not sit down with him to close out his official visit, did not sit down one-on-one with him and have a meeting, which is usually the way that you close out official visits, according to Don. He said that this is the way that previous coaches, really dating back to John Bunning, has done it, where they have sat down with each recruit and talked to them, had a meeting to get to know even more about them and just give them that one-on-one time, which is something that I think is very important for Bill Belichick to do with recruits, to be able to land them in this recruiting cycle. You don't necessarily have the results on the field at Carolina, but the results are there in what Belichick did at the NFL level. He is viewed as one of the greatest football minds in the history of the game, if not the greatest. And kids really value being able to sit and talk with him. That did not happen with Vermeil. I'm not sure why, but it's a bad look for Bill Belichick. I'll tell you that. That's one thing that, it's one of the first bad looks that he's had this entire offseason. Most of the stuff has been pretty positive. This is a tough one to swallow because this is a 4-star prospect. It would make some sense if you did this with a prospect that was unranked, that a guy that was taking a visit to campus, but you ultimately knew you weren't going to bring in. Even still, I think you should probably give him that face-to-face time if you are allowing him to be on campus. But it would make more sense in that respect. This is a 4-star prospect and a guy that it seemed like Carolina really valued. They made sure that they got him on the official visit schedule despite them having to do it midweek. He was the only guy on campus at the time of his visit. So why, and it's in the middle of the summer. It's not during spring practice. Why could you not have a sit down with this kid? That is incredibly concerning, and something that hopefully is not going on with a lot of other guys that are major targets for Carolina. That'll be something that we got to monitor moving forward, see if there's more situations like that, if you see more kids that are admitting stuff like that. But I mean, that's certainly one that hurts because you like Nazir Pitchford. You think that there is some upside to his game, but a guy like Joshua Vermeil, he's another guy that I really liked and thought he could have been a really good piece for Carolina, and might have been even the more talented player of the two when you look at it. So hopefully this doesn't come back to bite Carolina later on down the line. You move on, 4-star edge rusher Elijah Garrison. He was another guy that was on campus for Carolina. This one back on May 29th. As I mentioned, that big weekend, a lot of guys making their decisions now. He commits to Penn State. This is not really that shocking. Penn State entered the month as the favorite for him. They end up leaving with his commitment. Carolina gave it a swing here. This was one of those guys that was a late add to that May 29th weekend. Wasn't a name that was being buzzed about for a long time. So I think, he wanted to see ultimately what Carolina could offer. Don't know how seriously he was ever taking Carolina. So this one, you'd love to have a 4-star edge rusher in this class. I think Carolina is still looking to add another 4-star edge rusher in this class at some point, but I don't think it's going to end up being Elijah Garrison when it's all said and done. I think he's probably pretty solidly committed to Penn State. And this is one that Carolina is going to have to officially move on from. Same thing at quarterback with 3-star quarterback Dramiel Crothers. Another one that's not really shocking. This one is not one that should stun anybody. Really, after the May 29th visit, I felt like, he in speaking to Inside Carolina, they said they didn't really get the feelings of this being a guy that was going to end up committing to Carolina. Didn't feel like he was someone that really gave them the vibes of someone that was that excited by what he saw in Chapel Hill. He ends up deciding to stay close to home because he is from the state of Kentucky and decides to go to Louisville. This one, not shocking at all, too, because Carolina ended up landing Noah Spinks. If they really thought they had a chance at Dramiel Crothers, they might have told Noah Spinks, hey, let's hold off here. We'll see what Crothers does, and then after that, we'll end up deciding whether or not we're taking your commitment. Carolina went ahead and took Noah Spinks' commitment earlier this offseason, so this one doesn't shock me in the slightest, and is one that Carolina fans I don't think should be too disappointed about. Pretty loaded at the quarterback spot. You don't expect that any of these guys are going to be looking to leave in the near future. Billy Edwards Jr., if he wins the starting quarterback job, there will be a battle again next year. And the other 3 guys that are in that room on scholarship will have a chance to battle for that job again next season. Even if Miles O'Neill ends up winning the job, I still think there's a good chance that some of these guys stick around depending on how good McNeil ends up playing. I mean, if he's a guy that ends up leading Carolina to a 6-6 season, even, ends up with a losing record, there's a chance that there could be another quarterback battle next offseason. So, yeah, Travis Burgess, the 4-star prospect from the 2026 class, don't feel like at the moment he's going anywhere. That's the guy that you're looking at as maybe the most talented in the entire room moving forward. Torrey Newkirk is still there. So the depth in that room, pretty good. Noah Spinks just adds to that. So that's a position that I think Carolina is probably ultimately done at. You move on to 3-star cornerback Jaden German. He ends up committing to Minnesota, the team that was, again, favored for him coming into the month. He officially visited Chapel Hill back during that May 29th weekend. There was some thought that when Carolina initially jumped into his recruitment, this could be one of the guys that they ended up focusing on. That doesn't end up being the case. Minnesota did a great job with him supposedly back in the spring. They do what they have to do here in the summer, and they end up landing his commitment for Carolina. They are pretty good at the cornerback spot right now. I think they may look to add maybe one more guy at that cornerback spot later on in the cycle. Maybe they do find somebody else that they like, but right now they've got Pitchford, who is inside of the top 1,000, a guy that they like, that they valued from the minute that they ended up offering him. And you've got Trey Johnson, who committed to Carolina without even ever visiting campus. So that's going to be a guy that they're pretty high on. I do think that right now, because of the decisions that have been made by those 2 guys, there are some guys, I don't think that's necessarily the case here with German, but there are some guys that have said we're good. Carolina's full at the cornerback position right now, or they've landed some guys that we don't think we're necessarily going to be able to navigate through. So I wouldn't be shocked if Carolina maybe added a 3rd corner. It seems like that's a pretty safe number for most classes at that position group. And especially with you losing a D. Willie at the end of the season, a guy that is going to at least provide some depth, potentially play a little bit more than that. You got a few other guys, including Jalen Thompson, who's also battling for that starting job, who's an upperclassman. Wouldn't shock me if Carolina took on another corner somewhere in this class, but it's probably going to be a lower-ranked guy. It's not going to be somebody that is ranked super high unless they can end up convincing someone to flip down the line that is a higher-ranked prospect than the 2 guys that they currently have in the 2027 class. You got unranked defensive lineman Demetrius Terrell. He commits to Tulane. This was one that Carolina brought him on campus. He officially visited Chapel Hill back on May 29th. I don't even know if he got a scholarship offer officially from Carolina. So when they brought him on campus at the time, I don't believe he had an offer. If he did, he kept it quiet. And you know, this was one where, again, Carolina's just looking to add bodies, I think, to that room, just looking to add certain body types. I think Terrell was one of those guys that sort of matched that. He also went to Parker High School, which is, if I remember correctly, that's Vodney Cleveland's high school. It was one of the guys that ended up committing last year. And so that could have been the other reason why Carolina was interested in him. He ends up going to Tulane. And so that's one that I don't think is any sort of concern for Carolina if they want to add another defensive lineman in this class. I think they are going to potentially look to flip somebody. I know one of the guys that a lot of people have been pushing for on the message boards. I don't know if there is any sort of smoke to this, but a lot of people think that Carolina should be pressing hard to try to flip John Archer, the in-state 4-star defensive lineman. He was one of those guys, if you go back and read my most wanted targets, he was one of the guys that was right near the top of that list. So, I mean, any in-state prospect would be more than welcome. I've also seen Xavier Perkins, a guy who is committed to Virginia Tech, as another name that Carolina could be potentially looking to flip. That could be more at the edge rusher position rather than the defensive line position. But regardless, that's what Carolina is looking to do on the defensive line. Doesn't look like they're necessarily focused there in terms of bringing in somebody here this weekend at the interior defensive line spot. At least they do have an edge rusher that is on campus that we'll tell you about here in just a minute. 3-star interior offensive lineman Sincere Wilkerson will not set a new official visit date after originally being scheduled to visit on May 29th. He's, for some reason couldn't make it to that official visit, but was saying for the longest time that he was going to end up rescheduling. Carolina fills up at that position. It feels like for the most part, Carolina is full there. They're looking for somebody, I believe, that can play center. So Chavez Dixon right now on the interior of the offensive line is committed. You've got Luifi Tosai and then Neil Roberts, all committed to Carolina that are listed as interior offensive linemen. Carolina looking for somebody, as I mentioned, that can play center. That's why they're still interested in Cooper Hodson out of Providence Day High School in Charlotte. And they're also, could be some guys that they're looking at still in the class that they feel like could play that center position that they could potentially bring in as an interior offensive lineman. Main focus is trying to find another offensive tackle in this class. Kelsey Adams is one of the big targets that Carolina had on campus that they're hoping they can find a way to flip from Georgia. There's not as much optimism there as there once was. It seems like that has changed in the last day or so. And so now the focus is on Khalil Johnson, the offensive tackle out of Archbishop Malheur High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. LSU is the team that a lot of people have looked at with him for a while. Georgia Tech also doing well in the race for him, but Carolina is right there. That's going to be one that Carolina hopes to add in this class. If not, they're going to be probably furiously looking to add another offensive tackle in this class at some point or attempt to flip somebody later on down the line as we get into the season. 6 guys that were expected to officially visit this weekend. They are no longer officially visiting this weekend. That would be 3-star running back Senior Brooks. He was a guy that I thought at one point was on campus last weekend or was scheduled to be on campus last weekend. He was looking at this weekend as being the date that he was going to be on campus. He ends up canceling that visit. So now his recruitment just completely gets reset. 3-star edge rusher James Harris Jr. This was a guy that Carolina was in on for a while. There are some people that were saying that they were looking at him more as a linebacker as opposed to an edge rusher, an off-ball linebacker. And so he is now off the official visit list for this weekend, especially if he's at linebacker. Carolina's pretty full there outside of taking someone like a blue chip prospect like Theo Wilson. 3-star cornerback Nathaniel Mensah. He's probably going to end up at Utah. It was down to Carolina and Utah heading into this month. Carolina ends up landing 2 commitments at that position, and it appears like Mensah thinks that Carolina's full, and so he is moving on. 3-star interior offensive lineman Ryan Moore out of the state of Georgia. Not shocking there, as we mentioned, inside interior offensive line seems pretty full unless you can play center. Zhao Saujo, a guy that was expected to visit back on May 29th, moved his official visit back to June 19th. Now he is no longer making that visit, and so again, another interior offensive lineman that just doesn't seem like he's going to fit into the cards with what Carolina already has. An unranked defensive lineman, Raheem Saunders. This was another guy that just popped up sort of out of nowhere at that defensive line spot for Carolina. Not even sure if he had an offer from the Tar Heels officially, but that was somebody that Inside Carolina reported was supposed to be coming to campus this weekend as of earlier this week that announced he is no longer coming to campus. All right, now let's look at the guys that are actually on campus for Carolina this weekend. There's 4 of them that we can confirm as of right now, and that is because of what they have posted on social media. You've got 3-star wide receiver Chad Willis out of Orchard Lake St. Mary's Prep. Oof, that is a mouthful. Out of Southfield, Michigan, guy that is committed to Cincinnati, has been committed to them since early May. Did take an official visit there, but is still looking as if he is, on the market in this class. He did go to Auburn last weekend. They reportedly did pretty well with him, but he is in Chapel Hill for this official visit, and this is a guy that fits for Carolina, even if they end up taking Amari Patterson and they've already got the commitment from Anthony Williams. He's a guy that's 6'2.5", 215. So this is someone that fits in very well in terms of measurements on the outside. I think this is exactly what Carolina is looking for, trying to land one at each position group. And I think he would be the guy that Carolina is most wanting at this point in this class to go along with Patterson if they end up landing him later today, and Anthony Williams. I think that would be something that Carolina would be very comfortable with. Now it's about being able to prove yourself over what he's seen at Cincinnati, where he's probably going to be considered a pretty valuable piece for them, and what he saw last week at Auburn. I do think the fact that he made it to campus gives Carolina a fighting chance. I mean, especially with what Carolina has done recently on the recruiting trail, feels like just about anybody that they get to campus, they at least have a chance to be able to land, because they have done a much better job here in recent weeks of turning the heat up on some of these guys and convincing these guys that things are at least going in the right direction to be able to land their commitments. So definitely a guy that we will be monitoring here over the week, and not sure exactly when he's going to make a decision on what he's doing, but that'll be one that we'll be monitoring here heading out of the weekend for sure. You move on to unranked wide receiver Malik Ratliff out of Northwestern High School in Rock Hill, South Carolina. It's a guy that Carolina offered last offseason when he was at one of their camps with South Point High School. That is the rival high school. If you're someone that is from this area here in the Charlotte area, you know that that is the rival high school of Northwestern, but he ends up transferring to the rival school for this year. 6 foot 170. So this seems like the guy that's the backup plan if Amari Patterson doesn't necessarily work out. He has not taken any official visits anywhere else. So this really is up to Carolina, it feels like. He's on campus, probably means that Carolina is the team that he's looking at, and it's up to them whether or not they're willing to take his commitment. It's a good spot to be in if you're Carolina. I think, again, it all comes down to what happens with Amari Patterson today, with how crazy that recruitment has been. Nothing is off the table. He could end up changing his mind last minute, even with Carolina trending in the right direction going in. But I do think that Malik Ratliff, this is a guy worth at least getting on campus. There's a reason why you ended up offering him when you did last year. He's been someone that's been on the radar for Carolina, at least for a little while. So I think this makes sense to at least bring him on campus, have him officially visit, show him what you need to show him, and have him ultimately as probably a backup plan if Amari Patterson ends up going somewhere else. They also have unranked wide receiver Micah McClintock out of Woodruff High School in Woodruff, South Carolina. This was a guy that was actually camping with Carolina in the King of the Hill 7-on-7 camps that Carolina has been having during the week earlier this week. And he was a guy that earned a scholarship offer during that time. He's a guy that's currently committed to Liberty, has been committed to them since June 2nd. But it's a guy that when you get an offer like this, he at least has to take the visit. He's been taking official visits elsewhere. Tar Heels, they are the last team on his official visit schedule after he visited Coastal Carolina, Florida Atlantic, and of course, Liberty. He was expected to visit App State this weekend, but when you get an offer like Carolina, he had to jump on that, and so he ends up in Chapel Hill instead. This is probably the backup plan for Chad Willis if that doesn't necessarily go the way that Carolina is wanting it to go. McClintock is 6'4", 220 pounds. So, I mean, again, very under the radar type of guy. I think they like the size that he brings to the table. And that's one of the main reasons that they're looking at him. I think that's, someone to keep an eye on as well. Now, thing is he's got other offers that he has on the table. He's taken other official visits, unlike Malik Ratliff. So I think this one's a little bit of a different situation where he might just hold on to his commitment to Liberty if Carolina is not willing to take his commitment right now, but could be a guy that could be a flip candidate later on down the line. Let's say Carolina loses one of their wide receiver commits. So that's the situation that you could be looking at. That's just how I read it going into this weekend. I could be just completely wrong. They could value McClintock a little bit more than I think based off of what they saw this week, but would not be shocked if he's sort of the backup plan to Chad Willis, and ultimately Carolina sort of keeps him at arm's length until Willis ends up making his decision. Then you've got unranked edge rusher William Bromelo out of the West Shore Rebels in Vancouver, British Columbia, and of course in Canada. He is a guy that right now, he graduated from high school. He's a guy that is on basically an adult semi-pro team. Is how I have read it from some of the people that have looked at him and done a little bit of a deeper dive. I tried to do my own deep dive on what exactly they are. It doesn't seem as if they are a college of any sorts, but they're a group that plays football in Canada in the Canadian Junior Football League. And so this is a very interesting name that pops up on the radar for Carolina. This was someone that wasn't even on the radar entering Friday. And just all of a sudden on social media, you see that he's a guy that says he's going to officially visit Chapel Hill this weekend. And so we threw him on there, and he's part of the group that is on campus. Think this is one of those things where, again, talked about the contingency plans at wide receiver. I think this is a contingency plan if Carolina is unable to flip one of their bigger targets at the edge rusher position. They have some guys that they're looking at now that they believe that they might be able to flip at some point, either during the summer or later on down the line into the season. I think that's probably the direction that they're leaning here. And this could be a guy that, hey, maybe they just take a shot in the dark on, because doesn't seem like he's played a lot of football. When you look him up, he's a guy that has a lot of basketball background. So this seems like a pretty raw prospect, a guy that is just now getting into football or has in the last couple of years. So maybe this is someone that, Bill Belichick kind of views as a diamond in the rough, and looks as one of those end of the roster guys that you add. You never know what ends up happening, and if he turns into something great, this is sort of what you can expect, I think, with Bill Belichick and his staff every single year, is that they are going to find a couple of guys that are just complete mysteries. You're going to have no idea what they are heading into it. But at the same time, they could turn out to be something, because we've seen it with guys that he's had in the NFL. The guy that most notably sticks out whenever you bring up that example is Chris Hogan, former lacrosse player that he turned into a wide receiver and turned out to be pretty decent for a few years Now, granted, part of that is probably because of Tom Brady, but also a lot of that is due to what Bill Belichick was able to do with him and how he was able to develop him. So you never know. Bromelo could be one of those guys that Carolina is looking to do that with as well. But it definitely feels like this could be just a body that Carolina adds in an attempt to cover their bases in case they can't land a commitment in the class from one of their bigger targets, one of their flip targets that they have at the edge rusher position. The last guy that is on campus is an interior offensive lineman, and this is the reason why I think he's on campus, is because he's a guy that they view as someone that can play center. This would be Jaden Lindsey, the 3-star interior offensive lineman from Good Counsel High School in Olney, Maryland. He is a guy that just committed earlier this month to Colorado following an official visit there. But there is belief that he is a guy that is still open in terms of recruiting. Now, his social media wouldn't tell you that. Everything that you see on social media pretty much is him promoting. Yeah, I mean, there's some of him promoting his teammates, but a lot of it is him promoting Colorado. But at the same time, we've seen guys that have done this before, that behind the scenes have been taking visits elsewhere. And there are a couple of people that have thrown this out there as a rumor. So I cannot confirm that he is on campus. He is one that has not posted anything on social media. All of the other guys that I talked about, they have. And so to confirm that they are there. So that tells me that even if he is there, he is someone that is wanting to sort of keep this a little low key, just see what his options are. Ultimately, at this point, stay committed to Colorado, but check out, another option that could be there for him. He's 6'3", 275 pounds. And, I think that, some people have said he has the ability to play center. So that could be a big reason why Carolina is potentially looking at him. Carolina did add a center last year in the class in Will Conroy. That's the first time in a while that Carolina has gone that route to add a center. So this could be another move just to really shore up that position if Carolina is wanting to. We'll just have to see whether or not there is interest from Jaden Lindsey if the visit is actually happening. Hopefully we'll get some sort of confirmation on that. If we do, I'll make sure to put that out on social media. But that is your look at the guys that are on campus this weekend. Not really as exciting as the first 3 weekends of visits. You're not going to see any of the big names. Chad Willis is that most significant name that you're going to be keeping an eye on and hoping that Carolina can land. But at the same time, I definitely think that this is, a weekend that Carolina can use to sort of close out this class. Especially at the wide receiver position. I think that's one of the main goals for Carolina heading out of this weekend is make sure you've got the guys that you want at wide receiver. We're going to be monitoring Amari Patterson and what he ultimately ends up doing later on today. So there's going to be an edition of the podcast here soon. It's either going to be tomorrow or Monday where we will be diving into Amari Patterson and what he brings to the table for Carolina if he lands here, or the direction that Carolina goes if he does not. So regardless, there will be a podcast edition for you guys talking about Amari Patterson's decision, whichever way it ultimately goes for Carolina. We're going to have that covered over there on the website too, HeelToughBlog.com. Make sure you head over there. Keep tabs on that around that 6 o'clock hour. We will have an article that will be going up shortly after his decision for you guys to tell you what exactly happened and what Carolina ultimately has to do if they end up landing him or if they if he ends up going elsewhere. Regardless, we will have you covered on that front over there on the website. There's plenty of other stuff up there for you guys to check out right now. We'll have the article going a little more in depth on the guys that we just talked about. That will be going up for you guys here momentarily after the podcast is over. So make sure that you check that out. And then if we get that news confirmed by Jaden Lindsey, we will add him to that article to make sure that we have you guys up to date on everything that is happening this weekend in terms of recruiting on campus there in Chapel Hill. course, coming up soon, guys, I already started writing the quarterback one and, going to be progressing here throughout the next couple of weeks. It is time for the position previews to get you ready for this 2026 season. So we'll be doing the deep dive on this roster for you guys heading into fall camp. Make sure that you guys are keeping an eye on the website for that. Those are some of my favorite articles to write every single year. And it's definitely ones that you guys eat up. So make sure that you guys are keeping a lookout for that. And then me and Josh, you will get his opinion on all those position rooms as well, because my opinion is what you see in those articles. We'll have that coming up for you guys here in the coming weeks here on the podcast side of things as well with our in-depth position previews. So don't want to miss any of that stuff coming up, getting you ready for the 2026 season. In terms of the podcast, make sure that you guys are subscribed to us here on the YouTube page. If you are watching there, we greatly encourage you to do that. And even if you aren't someone that's watching there, we really, really are asking, please, can you help us out by just subscribing to that YouTube page? We're trying to get to 1,000 before the start of the season. We're hoping that if we can get to 1,000, that will help us to get some sponsors here at some point. So if you could help us out, just head over to that YouTube page, Heel Tough Blog, search it up there in the search bar, and then go to our YouTube page and give us a subscription. We would greatly appreciate that. And when you do, you get both this podcast and the Four Corners podcast whenever we ultimately go live. It'll send you a notification. That's something you definitely want. We also appreciate you if you're watching over on Facebook at Heel Tough Blog over there. And same thing with the Twitter page at Heel Tough Blog on Twitter, or at HTB_Josh is where we originate from, because that is the account that he used the premium upgrade for at the time. He thought he was doing it on the Heel Tough Blog account. Didn't necessarily work out that way, but we still make sure that we post it on the Heel Tough Blog page for you guys to take a look at. So make sure you guys are keeping up with that. And the Four Corners podcast just had a new edition that we dropped yesterday, talking a little bit about the Tar Heels' newest target in the backcourt to fill that final roster spot that they have. Maybe 2 scholarships are available, but we're not 100% sure on that right now. Angelo Brizzi, the transfer out of Buffalo, he just received an extra year of eligibility. Carolina has expressed interest, while there is some news on the Wee Lin side of things as well. We talked about that on the latest edition of the podcast. So do that right now. After this podcast is over, head over there, check out the latest edition of the Four Corners podcast to get caught up on all of that. But that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening to this edition of the podcast. And as always, go Tar